Welcome to this explainer. I want you to imagine, just for a second, that the entire global economy is this massive, extremely high-stakes board game. You've got trillions of dollars of goods and services moving across the board every single day. But unlike a simple game of Monopoly, this particular board is governed by an invisible, incredibly complex web of really rigid legal frameworks. So today, we're going to make that invisible web visible. We are going to unpack the rules of the game. And that brings up a pretty fascinating core question. How exactly do you police trillions of dollars in global trade? I mean, this brings us to the ultimate tension that really defines our modern world. On one hand, you have these strict international rules demanding free, open markets. But then, on the other hand, you have domestic politics, right? Countries desperately want to protect their own industries and their own workers. And trying to balance those two opposing forces, well, that requires a massive legal infrastructure. Okay, let's dive into this with a clear roadmap of exactly what we're going to cover today. We'll start with the basics: goods, services, and tariffs. Then we'll look at real-world tariff disputes. From there, we'll unpack how we navigate rules of origin. After that, we'll examine technical barriers to trade, explore how to handle economic emergencies, and finally, we'll navigate the incredibly complex free trade agreement web. All right, let's establish the fundamental playing field with Section 1, Goods, Services, and Tariffs. So here's the absolute baseline of global trade law. The World Trade Organization essentially divides the world into two main categories, and they are governed in completely different ways. First up, we have the goods trade, governed by the GATT. This is literally everything tangible. Things you can drop on your foot. Because they're physical, they're regulated directly at the border with customs frontiers and tariffs. But then, look at the other side, the services trade, governed by the GATTs. Services are intangible. You can't exactly stop a digital banking transaction or a streaming service at a physical border checkpoint, right? So instead of border tariffs, services are regulated behind the border. This is done through domestic laws, licensing criteria, and qualification requirements. For decades, the absolute ultimate weapon in regulating physical goods was the tariff. It's essentially a giant toll booth tax right at the border. But just look at this dramatic plunge. Back in 1947, when the GATT was first established, the global average tariff on industrial products was hovering around 40%. That is a huge hurdle for any business, and it's a cost that ultimately gets passed down to what you and I pay at the store. But skip ahead to 1995, following the Uruguay round of negotiations, and that average had plummeted to just 4%. We've systematically neutralized that traditional border tax over the decades. So if tariffs are historically that low, what actually happens when countries try to sneak around those limits? That brings us to Section 2, real-world tariff disputes. Now, what's really interesting about this case with Russia is the sheer rigidity of international trade law. When Russia joined the WTO, they legally bound their tariffs for certain goods like paper and palm oil at a set percentage, let's say 5.4%. But a bit later, global prices dropped, and Russia's domestic industries really started hurting. So what did they do? They introduced a minimum specific duty that forced European exporters to effectively pay 7 to 9%, which completely breached their agreed ceiling. Russia tried to argue that these were just temporary economic stabilizing tools. Well, the WTO panel struck it down immediately. The ruling was crystal clear. Bound tariff commitments are absolute. Experiencing economic difficulties simply does not justify breaking the rules. And we see a very similar clash of eras in this case involving India. Back in 1996, under the Information Technology Agreement, India promised to keep tariffs on IT products at 0%. But fast forward to the 2010s, and India wanted to protect its massively booming Make in India campaign. So they slapped 10 to 20% tariffs on newer electronics, like advanced smartphones and base stations. India's defense? They argued that smartphones literally didn't even exist in 1996, so they shouldn't be bound by some ancient agreement. The WTO completely rejected this. The principle here is absolutely crucial. Technological evolution does not invalidate a country's legal commitments. If a new product fits the functional description of the old agreement, the old rules still apply. It keeps the rules of the game predictable, which, at the end of the day, affects exactly how much you pay for your next tech upgrade. Because traditional tariffs are so heavily restricted now, countries have to use other incredibly complex mechanisms to control trade. Let's check out Section 3, Navigating Rules of Origin. Before you can apply any trade policy to a product, you have to know its true nationality, and that is exactly what rules of origin are for. Think of them as the ultimate DNA test, or like a passport for a product. They're totally essential for two big things: claiming zero tariff perks under preferential free trade agreements and enforcing non-preferential WTO policies, like anti-dumping duties or import quotas. Basically, if you don't know where a product is really from, you simply can't regulate it. Let's move to and see how this builds, because determining origin is definitely not easy when parts are flying in from all over the globe. There are three main criteria used to prove a product underwent what they call substantial transformation. First up is the change in tariff classification. This just means the raw materials were transformed so much that the final product gets a totally different customs code, kind of like importing raw timber to manufacture a finished wooden chair. Second is the value content criterion, where a specific percentage of the product's value, let's say 40%, must have been added locally within the exporting country. And third is a specific manufacturing process. A classic example here is the yarn forward rule in textiles. That means literally everything from spinning the yarn to cutting the fabric has to happen within the trade zone to actually qualify.
Beyond just rules of origin, domestic regulations can also severely impact trade. So let's look at Section 4, Technical Barriers to Trade.
And this brilliantly illustrates the constant tightrope walk of global trade. The TBT agreement applies to all products, whether they're agricultural or industrial, and its primary purpose is basically twofold. On one side, it aims to avoid unnecessary obstacles to international trade by promoting unified global standards, which is great because it keeps costs down for everyone. But on the other side, it absolutely must respect a country's regulatory autonomy to protect its legitimate domestic interests, things like human health, safety, and the environment. Basically, you can absolutely require child-safe caps on medicine, but you cannot design that safety regulation just to deliberately lock out your foreign competitors. But even with all these rules in place, sometimes economies just stumble. Let's turn to Section 5, Handling Economic Emergencies. Now, the system isn't completely merciless, right? It actually has built-in panic buttons or relief valves. There are three main emergency tools we need to know. First, safeguard measures. If an unforeseen, sudden surge of imports threatens to completely wipe out a domestic industry, a country can hit pause and temporarily raise tariffs just to survive. Second is the balance of payments crisis tool. If a nation is literally running out of foreign exchange reserves, they can restrict imports to stop the bleeding. And third is authorized retaliation. This is a tool of absolute last resort, where a winning country is legally permitted to punitively tax a rule breaker's exports just to force them back into compliance. But here's the catch. Even pressing that panic button has strict rules, as we saw in the U.S. wheat gluten case. The U.S. faced a sudden surge of wheat gluten imports and launched a safeguard investigation. In their calculus to prove their domestic industry was suffering serious injury, they included imports from Canada and Mexico. But when it came time to actually apply the protective tariff, the U.S. suddenly exempted Canada and Mexico because of NAFTA. Well, the European Union challenged this, and the WTO ruled against the U.S. It established the strict rule of parallelism. It means there has to be legal symmetry. If you count a country's imports to prove that you're injured, you legally must include them in the final tax. You simply can't have it both ways. Finally, let's look at how all of these overarching global rules intersect with regional agreements in Section 6, Navigating the FTA Web. I mean, just look at this incredibly tangled web of Vietnam's trade networks. Economists affectionately call this the spaghetti bowl effect, and it's pretty obvious why. Vietnam is part of ASEAN, the CPTPP, RCEP, and holds bilateral agreements with the EU, the UK, Japan, and honestly, so many more. Every single one of those lines represents a totally different agreement, with different tariff schedules, different rules of origin, and different technical standards. If a Vietnamese manufacturer wants to export a shirt to Europe versus exporting that exact same shirt to Japan, they have to navigate entirely separate legal frameworks. Mastering these intersecting rules isn't just some boring administrative chore. It is an absolute necessity for survival in the modern economy. It literally dictates everything from international supply chains to the final price tag on your clothes. And that brings us to a quote that really perfectly summarizes everything we've unpacked today. The entirety of global trade law is a delicate balancing act. It's this constant, never-ending tug-of-war between the economic efficiency of international standards and the political reality of protecting domestic interests. It's a system designed to keep the game fair, even when the players are constantly looking for a competitive edge. And all of this leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. We've seen how rules are enforced, how origins are tracked, and how emergencies are handled. But as geopolitics shift and these overlapping spaghetti bowls of agreements just keep growing more and more complex, we really have to ask, if the rules of the game are constantly changing, who is really winning? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope you walk away with a much clearer view of the invisible framework that's powering our world. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.